Welcome to this video on labor-based grading. If you've worked or taught or learned in the North American educational system, you're probably familiar with what we're going to call traditional grading, a weighted average or total number of points contributing to creating a student grade. You might be wondering, what the heck is labor-based grading? So to help you understand and to unpack what labor-based grading is, we're going to use a comparison and contrasting strategy, a compare and contrast strategy to think about grading workflows. In traditional grading, you ask yourself a set of questions as you set up your course. What activities will the students do? How much do I value those activities? How well did the students do in each activity? And then at the end of the semester, you compute a grade. So if we unpack that, what activities the students do, we typically come up with things like homework, quizzes, exams, maybe lab, maybe participation. There's other things that could be in here. And then we ask ourselves how much we value that activity. And we come up with some sort of weighted average or total number of points for each category of activity. And then during the semester, we ask ourselves how well the students did on each activity, and they earn a score on each one. And then finally, at the end of the semester, compute their course grade by combining their scores with our weighted averages and come out with the final grade that we report to the registrar's office. Labor-based grading employs a similar set of questions, but they change them up just a little bit with some subtle but important differences. Labor-based grading starts out with, what activities will the student do? Just like traditional grading did. Except that there's two categories of activities in labor-based grading. There's the required activities, things like homework, quizzes, reflections, tests if you're using them. In a labor-based situation, you certainly can. There's also things like standards-based grading that work well for tests that are similar to labor-based grading. But then there's also the extra labors. Those are things you might expect your A student to be able to do, but not your C student. So more in-depth things. Maybe it's reading more articles or reading deeper articles or harder articles or writing a paper or doing a certain number of hours of community service. There's a lot of different things you could do as extra, but they contribute to your learning outcomes in the course. They're still focused around your learning outcomes. You just don't expect all students to complete them. And you don't expect a student who completes them to complete all of them, as we'll talk about later. After you've thought about the activities that students will do, you ask, how many activities do I want students to do well? And you use that information to decide how many of the required labors that the students can turn in late, that the students can turn in but not get completely correct, that students could just not turn in at all. There's some different categories that you could put in here, but those are the basic ones. Turn in late, turn in and not finish all the way, and not turn in. And then those form a base grade for the student. Then the student completes additional labors that lead to the final grade, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, instead of asking yourself how well the student did each activity or during the semester, you instead ask the question, did the student meet my expectations for each activity? And then they get a score of complete or late or missed or incomplete on that activity. So instead of a score of 13 out of 20, homework 1 is complete or incomplete or turned in late, but complete, etc. But what is complete? Well, this is the important thing. You get to decide what complete is. You want students to hit a minimum standard for you to say, yes, that's complete. So Calvin's probably not going to get full credit here. He's not going to get marked complete. If you're in a discipline that has a standardized test, like engineering, the Fundamentals of Engineering exam, or nursing, the NCLEX exam, or medicine has boards, those kinds of things, those can be places to start with ideas for what might be sufficient, what might count as complete. For example, in the Fundamentals of Engineering exam, the threshold to pass is usually about 70%, and somebody who gets 70.5% on the exam passes, as does somebody who gets 99.5% on the exam. So it's about figuring out what is acceptable to you, what's an acceptable level of performance that students should be able to do in your course. And then finally, after you've asked that question, you compute the course grade using the lookup table that you created, where the student's performance on the required labors lands them at a base grade, for example, a B, and then their completion of extra labors, the student did 2, gets them a boost to bump the student's grade up to an A-. So the student earns an A- in the course. So maybe that sounds really cool and interesting, and you're thinking, oh, there's no way I can do that for my whole course. How might I do that for part of my course? So for implementing this partially in a course, it's a nice way to test it out, actually. You can just choose one component of your course where you're going to use labor-based grading. So in this case, the cure component of the course. And then you set up your cure component just like we talked about the labor-based grading for the whole course, except it's only for the cure portion. And at the end of that portion of the course, when you're calculating grades, notice that I did change from grade points to percentage points here. You end up with a final grade for that portion of the course. So the student would have earned a 91% in the cure portion of the course. You go ahead, you plug that back in to your grading rubric overall, just like you'd plug in homework or test scores, and you can compute your course grade like you typically do. So why might you use labor-based grading, or when might it be good? Well, it works really well on a situation where you don't know what the right answer is, like research, if you're trying to include research in an undergraduate course, because you want students to learn and find out, and we all know that sometimes things don't go the way you plan, and it's about what you do to try and accomplish that, or try and deal with that not knowing, that is what really matters and is the skill that we're really trying to get students to learn, not necessarily the correctness. So it's a great option there. There's some other really good reasons to use labor-based grading in courses overall. One is student mental health. Grades are stressful for students, especially high-performing students, and so this gives students a lot more agency in their grades, and as a lot, if they understand what's going on, it does require you to help them understand what's going on. But if you do that work, it can really reduce student anxiety over grades, which is a big win. It can also cut down on academic dishonesty because there's much less motivation to cheat to get the right answer. You're trying to learn and get it complete. And it also promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you're interested in learning more, you can read the book Labor-Based Grading Contracts, which was written for the humanities, but is easily adapted to the STEM disciplines. And you can check out my colleague Chris Marriott's much longer YouTube video and much more detailed YouTube video on how he uses labor-based grading in a STEM classroom, in particular in computer science. So with that, thanks for listening. Have a great day.